Welcome to Christendom Conversations. Together we'll explore the wisdom of the Catholic intellectual tradition, engage with thought-provoking ideas, and uncover deep insights into the perennial questions. We're thrilled to have you with us. Let's dive into today's conversation. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Daniel Spiotta to the podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Professor Spiotta is a professor in the Department of English Language and Literature here at Christendom. And it's good to have you with us.
It's good to be here.
Could you say a bit about your journey, your intellectual journey, your personal journey? Tell us a bit about yourself.
Surely. Thank you. Especially with regard to Tolkien, that question takes me back to as young as I can remember, with my dad reading The Lord of the Rings to us, reading The Hobbit to me and my brother. And just the simple joy of experiencing the wonderful literature as it shaped my imagination from a really young age. So I just remember how wonderful it was to receive those stories from my dad's lips, and to be imagining along with these characters, and that love really grew with me as I grew up from being before 10 all the way through really today. I'm even now I'm listening to The Lord of the Rings right now.
Wow.
Again, and it grew and matured. One of the things that I've read later on in life from C.S. Lewis was his admonition that he always thought it was silly when anyone said that he had read a book, and then if Lewis asked him, did you read it twice, and he said no, he would say he knew that that person hadn't read the book.
Right.
And so Lewis's point is that the reading is always best as rereading.
Wow.
And so I guess I just want to say that I've found that to be true as I've returned to this awesome story, The Lord of the Rings, and the other myths that Tolkien created around it at every period of my life, right? Every rereading has unveiled, I think, at least to me, like new valences of the way God has made the world, and in really formative ways, right? Moving the heart, moving the mind, inviting me to look more deeply into beauty and into why God made beauty, how beauty moves us in the world, and then to see that not only in sort of beautiful shapes that come to the eye, but beauty as friendship, beauty as magnanimity of soul, as heroic activity. These lessons, these realities unfolded themselves to me in many ways, of course, but largely through my engagement with Tolkien's work.
Yeah. Well, so I'm imagining your father reading to you. How did you go from your father reading? How did that lead you from a childhood encounter with Tolkien to ultimately becoming a professor of English and English literature?
Yeah. So my parents read to me a lot of different beautiful, good books. Tolkien stands out amongst the reading that they read to me. And what they gave to me there was simply the love of story, right? Or rather, what they aroused in me was that love of story. God gave me the love of story, as He's given everybody a love of story.
It's in our nature, I think.
Yes. But at least for me, Tolkien was the one who fed that love of story. And I think he is a great author to whom God has given a gift to arouse that love of story and the love of the reality that those stories give us access to in so many people. I mean, almost everyone, I think, who reads him encounters that. So we started there just with the love of the story, and that love led me back to the story. And as I continued coming back, growing up, as my mind grew in the way that it does when we grow, right? Coming back to the story with a new and renewed mind, sort of every time, I think that really deepened my sense of what literature can do, right? That it's not a one and done, that it's not like what C.S. Lewis was criticizing,
right?
But that there is this ability to continue deepening your possession of something that you already had. That's something which I am quite comfortable calling a philosophic at least relevant to the philosophic habit of mind.
Sure.
I didn't know about that when I was 10 or 15 or 18. But having grown up, having gone to school, having encountered John Henry Newman talking about this philosophic habit of mind, which he sees all liberal education as aiming to form, I recognized that was what was happening in me and being drawn out in me through my love of this story and being given to me by the love of Tolkien as a storyteller, as a man who had a vision and was crafting it and giving it to me. It's kind of wonderful to imagine him as doing this act of charity for me.
Yeah,
So yeah, I suppose that's my sort of larger account that just as I went and studied other things, other literature, had philosophy and theology, those goals of the formation of the all summed up in this philosophic habit of mind, made sense to me as something I had been experiencing under the tutelage of Tolkien.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Well, thank you. You just gave me something that I don't think I've ever thought of, which is that, when I think of Newman's philosophical habit of mind, this part of that's a drive toward the whole, trying to get a vision of the whole, of an integrated vision of reality, which Pieper talks about extensively. But I wonder, based on what you've said, if maybe one of our first experiences of a whole in that sense is a story, something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we experience the satisfaction of that.
Yes.
And that makes us go out looking for other integrated things,
yes.
integrated visions.
Yes.
So in a way, encounters with story in the way that you're describing it is a kind of seminary of integrity.
That's right.
It inculcates within us awakens within us a desire for the whole.
Truly.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, truly. Huh. Right. Yeah. It's wonderful to be able to participate in that, to have that sense of the whole, even from so young an age.
Yeah, but you weren't led astray by biology or chemistry or mathematics or philosophy or theology. You kept to the straight and narrow of poetry.
Well, surely, as Newman also points out, right? All of these things are form the circle, the sphere rather of wisdom. I hope that I have not scanted my understanding in biology and physics and mathematics and philosophy and theology either.
Sure.
Right. This, I think, is one of the beautiful things, is that by penetrating into, especially, I think, a literary whole, a story that include, as of course, beginning, middle, and an end, but also even of the kind of epic proportion that we see in Tolkien's work, it conveys a cosmic vision, which opens up ground for thinking about these other, for thinking about these other disciplines, right? And drawing in the relevance to your own understanding of the world that's unfolding, right?
Yeah. Is it your view that story is embedded in reality? I mean, that was one of the first questions that I confronted as a Catholic, having been formed as a sort of a high modernist, which was that it's basically chaos out there, but we make a story out of the realities we encounter, versus what I came to see as the Catholic view, which is that there's a story in reality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And we love Aristotle. I love Aristotle. Stories have beginnings, middles, and an end. And I think that secular view of you're making your own story as you go is like simply a failure to understand that fundamental insight that Aristotle lays out for us in the Poetics, that it has a beginning, middle, and an end. If it's a choose your own adventure without an end in view, how could there even be a story there? How could your meaning be understandable without an end towards which it's aiming? But that we can see why you would be inclined to think about that, because we don't have, at least in the secular sort of view, we don't have our end clearly before us, right? It's not easy to look and see the end before you. It's easy to look and appoint for ourselves certain goals, but each one of those ends is not conclusive, right? It's not an actually complete end, the whole meaning of my life. Right? the whole meaning of my part in the cosmos. I mean, that's clearly inaccessible to this kind of imagination.
Sure.
And it, in a sense, it's, I don't want to speak too far out of field here, but it strikes me as being inaccessible without some revelation, right? That we're given the view by Christ coming down, living out his own life, and revealing to us what what God wants us to know about the entire cosmos. It has a beginning, middle, and an end.
Right.
And we receive that end by faith, but in receiving it by faith, we are enabled, we're enabled to see how what I'm doing around here in my life, which seems inconclusive, which seems
Right.
somewhat chaotic, is in fact ordered upward to that end. And I think, to just try to clinch that circle, right?
Right.
I think that we have grounds for accepting that faith, although the faith is a gift from God, it's something that God gives us. But there are grounds that dispose us to understand the goodness of that offer that God gives us in the faith, in story, because we all love stories. We all love them, and we know that they have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
And insofar as we love them, we recognize that they're good and that the vision to which they attest is good, is lovable.
Right.
And it makes us it makes us desire that. And we recognize it as true, right?
Yeah. Well, I like the link you make between sort of theology and poetry there. And it reminds me of the classical epics beginning with the invocation of the gods and the muses, and even the way that that's continued in the Christian tradition.
Yes.
There is a clear link there. That's fascinating. So this idea that story is a part of reality. I've heard it said that, basically our lives, we often go into crisis personally when our personal stories stop making sense. And when the beginning and the middle don't make any sense about how we got where we are. And so there, without a story, things move toward a crisis. This role of imagination, I mean, the role of imagination within, both understood by Newman, but also, the way it makes you and informs your reading of Tolkien. Could you say a bit more about the role of imagination in all of this?
Surely. So on the Newman side of things, it strikes me that the way in which he uses this term has a lot to do with the imagination and the intellect are always closely conversing, right? And how one sees and understands the relationships between like everything in front of you, that we can. It's a wonderful notion, or it's a wonderful piece of philosophy, because the imagination itself is so interior and so specific to the person, and yet its goal is to make a philosophic account of the reality that's coming to it. And Newman sees our capacity to make that philosophical account, or to see into that philosophical account, like to truly say what are the real relations in reality, is largely given to us through this imaginative formation, how we see what's good, how we see the way in which to accomplish that good, or what is militating against it. And yet that is formed by I mean, in Newman's world, it's formed by so many things: music and music, poetry, literature, studies of philosophy, and studies of other things, studies of the natural world. All of these things fall into it. But I do think that the imagination is largely given its impetus and form by the reading of stories when we're young. So that I think that vision of what we need to do in order to have a true philosophy, we need to cultivate the imagination well, with beauty. This relates to Tolkien and his view of like the creative act, right? For him, imagination is, I think he usually tends to write about the imagination in terms of his own not his own, but in terms of creativity
Right.
itself. And so it occupies a different terrain
Okay.
than what Newman is
Sure. Sure.
immediately getting at with his treatment of the imagination.
Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking also about just the sort of the moral effects of a well-cultivated imagination in terms of helping you relate your own story to the larger story of reality. And also in some of the things I read that you had written, it involved Newman's reworking, of ancient epic, that he loved growing up. But he sort of inserted opportunities for hope within that epic, and then in the way those opportunities also manifest within the Lord of the Rings and his other writings.
Yes.
So he loved the story, but he also felt it was a bit fatalistic, right?
Yes.
And so could you say a bit about that, because that suggests some things about the imagination and the kinds of things that we could read ourselves or read to our children in terms of how we form their imaginations.
Yeah, beautiful. So if the contrast that comes to my mind in Tolkien's works with regard to this specific question is between a Norse myth about the Volsung saga,
Right.
which involves Siegfried going around and doing awesome things. He has to fight a dragon ultimately, and he does fight the dragon and does kill him, or Sigmund, sorry, does kill him, and yet is slain by him. Right. So in the Norse saga, you have a heroic action which is universally admirable, and yet which concludes with the death of the hero, the destruction of the hero. And so I want that to be on one side.
Sure.
And then you have the Beowulf story, in which you have a Christian knight, a Christian king who goes out and fights a dragon and is also killed. But he accomplishes something like really powerful, really
Right.
good in and of itself. Tolkien often, both in the Silmarillion and I think elsewhere, he engages that first fatalistic heroism. He sees that there's beauty. He sees there's a certain magnanimity in that hero, even in the sacrifice of the hero to offer up his life, and yet that Norse fatalistic like coloration of the whole story he finds to be a failure of artistic vision, right? A failure of truth in the art, at least if that art is aiming at the highest truth that it could express. And so he takes that story and continually modifies it. In the Silmarillion, or in his extended mythology, right, he has a story that's really similar. Another hero is sort of beaten down by fate all the time, but he's Turin-Turambar, it's the story, right? He does all these wonderful heroic things, but he's also enslaved, as it were, under the curse of Morgoth, like the chief person, the chief satanic figure in Tolkien's cosmos, and he is ultimately destroyed by his conflict with the dragon, like Sigmund. But even there, Tolkien envisioned, right, the apocalyptic sort of restoration of that justice.
Sure.
So I guess the thing that struck me from watching Tolkien at work with these two different dragon stories, and with these two different heroes, caveat for one moment, Tolkien, he's an artist. He loves to work with all of his work, but with all of those beautiful stories that he received in his education. But he did just simply translate Beowulf, as opposed to these other myths, which he ended up rewriting in order to include this apocalyptic righting of wrongs, right? A kind of eucatastrophe in which Turin-Turambar is allowed to come back and simply defeat the enemy at the very end. So Tolkien wanted to improve that story by letting those sufferings that Turin endured in his life become cosmically fruitful
Right.
in the final vision. Whereas with the Christian vision, he's just willing to say, this is good. This is already sort of in its way perfect, and I'll translate it. I'll
Right.
present it
Right.
to you because it's a beautiful thing to have.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Well, and all this discussion of epic and sort of the epic narrative. You've also spent a fair amount of time looking into and in your intellectual formation and training, into the basic theories of literary genres.
Mhm.
Um, and so you not only look at the big picture with Tolkien, but you've also looked at some very smaller, more modest
Mm.
miniatures. Like one of the things you wrote on was Sam's poem about Galadriel.
Mhm.
Could you say a bit about that and lyric poetry and how that fits in the formation of the imagination?
Yeah. So thank you for bringing up Louise Cowan. I love to talk about her all the time. So in her treatment of lyric poetry as a whole genre, she's asking, where does the impulse to lyric poetry come from? What is lyric poetry really doing? So lyric poetry, short poems,
Sure.
not telling the epic story. This is distinguished also from tragedy, which is a certain kind of story which manifests a certain aspect of reality, and from comedy, which manifests a different aspect of reality, sort of complementary with
Sure.
tragedy, I think. So Louise Cowan, sees the literary world as divided amongst these four different genres. In the lyric, the goal, she's asking you, what is the goal of it? And I love this insight she comes to. She draws it from a place Tolkien would love, from Cadman, it's him. So
Right.
it's one of the first pieces of writing that we have in Anglo-Saxon. Bede presents it to us in his history
Right.
of the English Church, and we found sort of the Anglo-Saxon version of it. And in this, his story is really beautiful. He's a
Right.
monk. He doesn't know how to sing. And in the monastery they have like their nighttime entertainment is they all have to sing a poem, and then he just leaves
Right.
because he can't have anything to offer. And then an angel comes to him as he's like sleeping in the goat shed or something like this, and it says, "Go back. You need to go." And he says, "What? I can't sing anything." And then this vision says, "You need to sing creation, right? Sing creation," and
Right.
that then he is given the power to go back into the meat hall and to sing beautifully, right? To sing about what God has made. Cowan points to that insight as the center of the lyric mode, to simply celebrate those things which God has created, which he has made. And there's all sorts of ways in which that can be developed.
Right.
You can have, one can be moved by the desire to sing creation and see that creation is broken in some way by evil and lament that. Or one can see that there's a good to be received, which we don't yet possess, so that we can look at with hope. So that's anticipation of a future good. But then the central aspect, the thing the human heart most wants to do, is simply to rejoice in the consummation that we have with our possession of beauty. We want to have beauty, whether that's the beauty of friendship, the beauty that one perceives in nature or in another person, or the beauty of God's relation to us. We want to
Right.
possess that and sing it. So that I think is like Louise Cowan's sort of insight about what lyric does. And I love that. I love to see this because I think Tolkien is on the same wavelength. We have Sam Gamgee in The Lord of the Rings. Funny character. He seems like a bumbling fool. He's in some video presentations of this early on, he's just presented as a clown. He's a gardener. He talks in a simple way. You can tell that he's got a sort of low accent, right,
Yeah.
in the way that Tolkien writes his character in his
Right.
speech. And yet, he loved Bilbo, and he loved to hear Bilbo's stories, and especially loved to hear Bilbo recite poetry. And so that's the first very slight hint. But throughout the entire Lord of the Rings, Sam continually develops in his love of beauty and his ability to create it and to articulate it. And I think that moment when um, he's trying to describe Galadriel in her beauty to the Lord Faramir when they've
Right.
been apprehended by Faramir walking in Ithilien. He takes them to the cave, asks them to talk, and then Sam all of a sudden opens up with he says to himself, I couldn't possibly describe it. I wish I had the whole scene memorized so I
Right.
could speak
Yeah.
the particular words. But in that moment, he's trying to describe the beauty of Galadriel, which he sees to be, on the one hand, high, magnificent, lordly. She's the queen. And on the other hand, simple, like like a maiden, right? Sort of terrible in her august majesty, but also eminently approachable. And so he sees the massiveness, the sort of wild extension of the kinds of things that pertain to this one person.
Right.
And his only way of expressing this to the Lord Faramir is to start using poetry.
Right. Right.
And Tolkien doesn't divide it up into lines or anything like that. But the structure of the things that Sam says, the images
Yeah.
that he draws, even even down to like
The structure.
counterbalancing,
Yeah. The structure.
specific kinds of images
Yeah.
with each other. It's very clearly is a poem. And one of the things I love is that at the end of this, Tolkien gives Faramir the line. It gives Sam first the line, but all of this is nonsense and wide of my mark, as though his attempt to tell Faramir what she was failed, because he realizes that like the actual vision of her beauty is far beyond his capacity to articulate.
Yeah.
And yet Faramir understands she must be lovely. Sorry, I've lost the actual words, but he picks up. Faramir uses two adjectives, which clearly crystallize and distill the essence of what Sam has been trying to express.
Right.
And that image of this complex relationship of beauty, gentleness, charity, and like the terror of majesty and that august reality is conveyed in a way that I think couldn't have been conveyed outside of the poem.
Yeah. Well, and I think what you just hinted at something that I think is really, really interesting, is I think for those of us who come from other backgrounds, at some point in our life, we can think that poetry could be summarized, paraphrased.
Mm.
And there's an easier way just to say this, right? And why are we going to all the trouble of putting it into some form other than a direct prose statement?
Mm-hmm.
Which, for those who have spent much time with poetry, you come to realize eventually that that's just not true. And so you suggested that there's something, it's more than just the sense of the words. It's also the structure.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way it's put together.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings us back to sort of the beginning, middle, and end. There's a structural dimension to poetry, whether it's lyric or epic, that goes beyond the sense of the words.
Mm-hmm.
And is that part of your work as a teacher as well, to introduce them not only to these structures and as well as the genres? How does your work as a teacher of this literature work within the larger tradition of liberal education?
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're talking about the sort of the structure of a informal poem by Sam Gamgee, or you're talking about an epic poem. I mean, what's this all doing? I can imagine there might be those who, certainly none of the people who are watching this or listening to it would say this, but there might be those out there who would say this is just entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we see it as a deep formation
Mm-hmm.
of great importance. Yeah, how would you speak to that?
Truly. First of all, I would just say amen. It is. I do believe that it is a deep formation of the human heart. So that's just the first sort of big statement. As far as what I do in the classroom, I understand that my discipline, that I have a discipline, right? And my discipline is limited. I don't get to get into the niceties of the theological detail or of the philosophical detail, right? And I want to recognize that
Sure.
there's more. I am at one part of the disciplinary circle, right?
Sure.
What I present, I'm at one part of this table. We have philosophy, we have theology, right. We have history, we have everyone else around the table as well. But I am confident that what I present is also able to be received by and interestingly augmented by, given insight to, by my philosophy, sure. By theology and whatnot. I do also have the conviction that what we're doing in the classroom by by helping students to see and to love, right, to know and to love the visions that have been cast by these poets, I am confident that that naturally leads them into a philosophic inquiry. It naturally leads them to desire to understand the gods better, or God, I mean, God better, by
Sure.
looking, say, at Homer, is what I'm teaching right now
Sure.
to the freshmen, right? And, I think that by looking at that epic vision that Homer casts, by doing some of the nitty gritty work of seeing how it's composed, but also by stepping back and asking the students and putting them into the near occasion of wonder by helping them to see these larger structures,
Right.
that that I'm very convinced, and I think I can show that that Homer has in his mind and wants to convey to us, that those apprehending those leads to that wonder, and it makes my students want to penetrate more deeply into their understanding of the way things are, right? Philosophy. And in so doing, this is going to lead them into asking, how are things the way they are? How did they get there, right?
Yeah.
What does this teach me about God, or what does my formation in faith, hope, and charity help me to understand about this reality?
Yeah. Yeah. No, so this is interesting. So I'm maybe you can help me put some things together. So when I was reading through some of your writings before, I think in one of the margins I made notes about the relation between. Again, there were a lot of resonances with Newman as you were talking about a lot of these things, and I know you've explicitly dealt with Newman in some of your work. But this idea that of the desire to know, the attraction toward the good. So the relation between loving, sort of that pursuit of the beloved, or not necessarily an individual, but loving of all that exists, that is real. How loving feeds, and that desire feeds into seeing. So loving into seeing, and if that's the philosophical act, whether we use that term or not, that desire to see all of reality, which in an integrated, non-reductive way, which in some ways is a summary of what liberal education is: a desire to see all of reality in a non-reductive way, in an integrated way. But there's a love that drives that. There's a love or desire that drives us to see. But then when we see, we also are humble enough, I hope, to realize that we're not seeing exhaustively, that it's still limited, it's still partial. But then that flows over for some into making, and that's where the poet comes in. So we may not share all three of those phases, but we share at least the first two. Do these three things line up in this way? Are there other ways to think about this? How do you understand sort of the loving and the desiring leading to the seeing, and then for some to the making?
Yeah. Love just wants to see. Right? I think this is just what love does, right? Love wants to have communion with the beloved, right? And for us, God has made us with intellect. And so not just with intellect, but to be preeminently intellectual, right? And so for us, the communion, the union with the beloved, is preeminently of understanding, right? Of the ability to know that beloved, right? So I do think that those things which generate in us a desire, that love, to penetrate more deeply into everything that God has made, right? This is what the intellect really wants, is to understand everything God has made and him.
And we'll never be satisfied.
We'll never be satisfied, right? So I think these stories generate the love for some little thing. So that part of the story, that glimpse, right? That vision of the cosmos, or that's what we get with epic, but there's all sorts of other little glimpses here, there, and everywhere that you get in the different kinds of other kinds of poetry. Each of those loves makes us desire to penetrate more deeply into the world that God has made with our understanding, and opens our eyes to what is mysterious. I think it makes us desire to know what's mysterious, and that desire puts us into the close contact with it. And it is my experience, and I think it's our experience, that God draws us to loving and wanting to understand mysteries so that he can reveal them, at least in part, right? He can at least begin to unfold those mysteries to us. Clearly, there are mysteries which will never fully be unfolded to us, which it is our joy to have all of eternity, or all of the rest of our unending existence with him through death, right, through and after death, and into our resurrection, right? We get the rest of eternity to continue to penetrate more and more deeply into what God wants to reveal to us about himself. But I think that journey starts early, and it starts with the generations of these loves.
Yeah. And then some people, the poets, they are inspired to praise what they've seen.
Yes.
They're inspired to bring out what they've seen in this vision to others, and to make poetry.
Yes, and the beauty. I one of the things I love about literature and thinking about it and reading it is that the way to praise beauty is by creating new beauty. Right? Is by this. Tolkien will call it subcreation.
Sure.
To create within a created environment, but still. So God is the primary creator. He makes everything that is, but he also gives to the poet the power of subcreation, of imagining new things that may not be, and imagining new relations that he may not have actually experienced in his own life, putting things into context, telling new stories that haven't been told. And so I think Tolkien sees that the way in which to respond to the beauties that God has made most fully is to be like him and to practice the creative art, which for us is, of course, always secondary and therefore sub-creation. But yeah, I think the soul's desire to give thanks to God is, at least in one important way, and for these artistic creators, is by practicing this art of creation.
Yeah.
A thing that I find really wonderful here as well is drawn from John Paul II, St. John Paul II's letter to the artists, where he very frankly indicates that the gift poets have is a kind of inspiration, is something that God has given to the poet to see and desire some beauty, some facet of reality that moves that poet and moves him in a way, poet, artist, whatever we want to say. I'm thinking about poetry, right? That moves him to try to give form to that vision so that he can share it with others. First of all, so that he can simply incarnate it and render that feeling, that sense, intelligible.
Right.
And the purpose of rendering it intelligible is to give, to communicate. And for John Paul II, that is an act that God has asked the artist to do for the good of the rest of us, right? So I think that's a really beautiful sort of way of complementing the vision of this sort of secondary creation that Tolkien so adamantly asserts, and I think so beautifully manifests.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that reminds me of sort of the Dominican idea of which I think we try to embody here, which is that we contemplate. In a sense, we contemplate because things are worth contemplating in and of themselves. But then we don't stop there. We communicate. We hand on the fruits of our contemplation. But with poets and with artists, that handing on is in the form of a made thing, something that they've made. So in addition to reading Tolkien to our children, reading really great literature ourselves, and maybe even making some, are there other things that, for those who aren't in the classroom today, are there other things that we should think about in light of what we've discussed with Newman and Tolkien? Are there other things that we can sort of integrate into our lives?
Yes. That we can integrate into our lives makes me think of practical questions like, how much time do I have to do this, that, or the other thing when my 4-year-old is screaming at me? There
are chapters in our lives, right?
That's right. So I understand that there are limits to what we can do, but I am convinced that the normal way for beginning our engagement with beauty, and for sustaining our engagement with the beautifulness of what God has made, has something to do with reading literature, right? I think that's a really important thing for us to be doing. So I would certainly encourage everyone to try to find some time to read a good story. I think stories are a really beautiful place to begin, and to continue developing across an entire life.
Sure.
Because they meet us so easily. I think lyric poetry is often, I shouldn't say I shouldn't try to cordon it off. Lyric poetry speaks to the heart, but sometimes it's found difficult, right? And reasonably so, because it is so dense. It's so
Right.
densely packed that sometimes it takes a taste, and it takes even the habit of having ruminated upon, right? Having
Right.
chewed the cud of other poems beforehand to be able to really, to be able to like look at some other lyric poem and say, oh, this is wonderful. It doesn't always immediately present itself to us. But I think reading story, trying to find time to read stories and just like develop the love of receiving story, is always going to be time well spent. It just strikes me, I've never done the metrics on this, but our Lord speaks to us in stories. He clearly, we can understand his life in terms of story.
Right.
It is the great story on which every other story that's worth its salt is modeled. But even he himself, when he's teaching us, how often does he turn to telling us stories and expecting us to mull on them? It's just such a wonderful thing. I'm sure we've all experienced it, that there's some parable that we know, that we've heard forever, and then 20, 30, 40 years into hearing the parable, we chew on it again.
Yeah.
And it reveals new things to us that we'd never thought of before. God is continually unfolding to us his truths through those stories. And so I think it's important for us to continue to build up that taste.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I'm thinking that there are easier and harder ways to go into story,
Sure.
but there are also easier and harder ways to go into poetry. I mean, often we might think, well, I don't read poetry, but then we ask, do we read the Psalms?
Yes.
There are different. I think the Psalms are a great gateway in, or even sometimes keying poems to certain liturgical days. So we have this odd family habit of I always read The Journey of the Magi by Eliot on Epiphany. And my kids still allow me to do that. I don't know how much longer I'll get away with it. But they still put up with it. But just keying in certain poems to certain times of the year that make that a little easier. So there's so many ways in. But thank you so much. I've learned a great deal from this conversation and enjoyed it very much. And we didn't even talk about Shakespeare. So
alas,
so alas, alack. So good. Well, good luck with all of your teaching, and thanks. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Christendom Conversations. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. To learn more about Christendom College and its mission, visit us at christendom.edu. Until next time, may we all continue to seek the truth, live the faith, and restore all things in Christ. God bless.